to abortion and birth control with no restrictions, no coercion, overthrowing the double day, and feminist consciousness raising. And so we believe that change comes from the actions of everyday people, not politicians, the courts, media, lobbyists. The freedoms that we have now were won by movements of women who are out there organizing and demanding change. And so in 1971, Redstockings founding member and longtime leader, Kathie Sarachild, who we are incredibly honored and grateful to have with us here today. Called Going for What We Really Want at the Women's Equality Day March and Rally. And now in 2019, facing even more threats against women's liberation, this is how we can continue to demand more freedom for women without compromise. A tool we use to inform ourselves as to what freedoms we are demanding for women is consciousness raising, a method of sharing our lived experiences so we can better understand how our so-called personal issues are actually political issues. And so consciousness raising was brought into the radical feminist movement by our sisters who were part of the civil rights movement, and that's where it was known as telling it like it is. So the power of consciousness raising is just one of many lessons that we have learned and continue to keep alive from Redstockings and the early radical feminists. Tonight, along with the singing that we just did, we will be reading from select Redstockings papers and doing CRs so we can reflect upon how the work that we are doing today is a continuation of what Redstockings brought forward in 1969. Woo! And now I'm going to introduce longtime activist and organizer from Redstockings, Carol Giardina.
Yes. Power to us women. Woo! I'm a longtime Redstockings and I'm a co-founder of Gainesville Women's Liberation in '68, so you have a mix of both. Redstockings took its name in 1969 when it was one of the founding women's liberation groups of the 60s. The name represents the union of two traditions, the blue stocking label pinned disparagingly on feminists of earlier centuries and red for revolution. The name was coined by Shulamith Firestone and Ellen Willis, who were founders of the group. Redstockings women would go on to champion and spread knowledge of vital women's liberation theory, slogans, and actions that have become household words, such as consciousness raising, the personal was political, the pro-woman line, the politics of housework, the Miss America protest, and speak-outs that would break the taboos of silence around subjects like abortion. Redstockings today is a new kind of grassroots activist think tank established by movement veterans for defending and advancing the women's liberation agenda. The Archives for Action is a project Redstockings established in 1989 to make the formative and radical 1960s experience of the movement more widely available for taking stock and needed for new understandings and improved strategies. Redstockings squares should be on the back table at the exhibit. There are also buttons, and take a good look at the exhibit. If you want to contact us, there'll be a sign-in sheet in a little bit, but you can also pick up a square. Thank you.
Is this being taped?
Yes. Yes, yeah.
Should people speak into a microphone for better sound? That's the sound, okay.
Hi. My name is Paulina Davis. I'm currently the chair of the New York City chapter of National Women's Liberation. And I'm going to be talking, and a member of our Women of Color Caucus. I lead in that group as well. And I'm going to be talking about the Redstockings Manifesto. And I think it's important to just take a moment to think about the importance of this document and what it actually represents.
Could you speak up a bit?
Sure. Yeah, okay.
I want to record it.
Thought it was live. So to talk about this document and sort of what it represents and the importance of recognizing what it reflects, right? And thinking about, as we're going to talk more about consciousness raising and how the women who founded Redstockings, who were coming out of radical feminist groups, were looking at their own experiences and looking at the conditions in their lives and talking to one another, as the song Fight On Sisters talks about, and realizing that what was happening to me was happening to this other woman and this other woman, and that it wasn't just a personal experience that I was having, but there was actually a political origin to it. And being able to articulate those beliefs in a document, right? And when we think about movements, that's always a critical point in a movement. And that's not new or unique to women's liberation. When we think about liberation movements in history over time, there's a point at which individuals come together and they talk about their own experiences, and they understand the sort of political significance of those experiences and commit to fighting for them, commit to trying to articulate that in some way, right? And that becomes something that the movement can return back to over time. Do we still hold these beliefs? Are they still true, right? Did they stand the test of time? And unfortunately they did, and that's why we're still here and still right? Because they continue to be beliefs that over time have endured, and like that, the fight has endured as well. And so at times and over the decades, there are moments, like in any movement, where it waxes and where it wanes. But the point is to keep fighting and to keep coming back to these ideas and these beliefs, and to keep working to learn from the history in the past, to develop the theories further and take them further, and to figure out the best ways to fight and how conditions have changed as a result of our fighting, so that we have to continue to analyze our experiences in those conditions anew, with using those theories to figure out how best we should fight now and what to prioritize. So with that, I'm going to start us off with the reading of the manifesto, and I've asked a few volunteers to chime in and to carry this forward, again, just as a way to reflect that this is something that, as an NWL member, but just as a woman generally in the US, that I think we all are a part of this legacy, this articulation of beliefs and ideas. So after centuries of individual and preliminary political struggle, women are uniting to achieve their final liberation from male supremacy. Redstockings is dedicated to building this unity and winning our freedom. Women are an oppressed class. Our oppression is total, affecting every facet of our lives. We are exploited as sex objects, breeders, domestic servants, and cheap labor. We are considered inferior beings whose only purpose is to enhance men's lives. Our humanity is denied. Our prescribed behavior is enforced by the threat of physical violence. Because we have lived so intimately with our oppressors, in isolation from each other, we have been kept from seeing our personal suffering as a political condition. This creates the illusion that a woman's relationship with her man is a matter of interplay between two unique personalities and can be worked out individually. In reality, every such relationship is a class relationship. And the conflicts between individual men and women are political conflicts that can only be resolved collectively.
We identify the agents of our oppression as men. Male supremacy is the oldest, most basic form of domination. All other forms of exploitation and oppression, racism, capitalism, imperialism, etc., are extensions of male supremacy. Men dominate women, a few men dominate the rest. All power structures throughout history have been male-dominated and male-oriented. Men have controlled all political, economic, and cultural institutions and backed up this control with physical force. They have used their power to keep women in an inferior position. All men receive economic, sexual, and psychological benefits from male supremacy. All men have oppressed women.
Attempts have been made to shift the burden of responsibility from men to institutions or to women themselves. We condemn these arguments as evasions. Institutions alone do not oppress. They are merely tools of the oppressor. To blame institutions implies that men and women are equally victimized, obscures the fact that men benefit from the subordination of women, and gives men the excuse that they are forced to be oppressors. On the contrary, any man is free to renounce his superior position, provided that he is willing to be treated like a woman by other men. We also reject the idea that women consent to or are to blame for their own oppression. Women's submission is not the result of brainwashing, stupidity, or mental illness, but of continual daily pressure from men. We do not need to change ourselves, but to change men. The most slanderous evasion of all is that women can oppress men. The basis for this illusion is the isolation of individual relationships from their political context and the tendency of men to see any legitimate challenge to their privilege as persecution.
We regard our personal experience and our feelings about that experience as the basis for an analysis of our common situation. We cannot rely on existing ideologies as they are all products of male supremacist culture. We question every generalization and accept none that are not confirmed by our experience. Our chief task at present is to develop female class consciousness through sharing experience and publicly exposing the sexist foundation of all of our institutions. Consciousness raising is not therapy, which implies the existence of individual solutions and falsely assumes that the male-female relationship is purely personal, but the only method by which we can ensure that our program for liberation is based on the concrete realities of our lives. The first requirement for raising class consciousness is honesty, in private and in public with ourselves and other women.
We identify with all women. We define our best interest as that of the poorest, most brutally exploited woman. We repudiate all economic, racial, educational, or status privileges that divide us from other women. We are determined to recognize and eliminate any prejudices we may hold against other women. We are committed to achieving internal democracy. We will do whatever is necessary to ensure that every woman in our movement has an equal chance to participate, assume responsibility, and develop her political potential.
We call on all of our sisters to unite with us in struggle. We call on all men to give up their male privilege and support women's liberation in the interest of our humanity and their own. In fighting for our liberation, we will always take the side of women against their oppressor. It will not ask what is revolutionary or reformist, only what is good for women. The time for individual skirmishes has passed. This time we are going all the way.
July 7th, 1969. And I should mention that Redstockings continues to get requests for reprints of the Manifesto every year. So again, it's something that obviously still resonates with people. Think about how hard it is to try to capture what we think are sort of the basis of our conditions and what's important about coming together and uniting to fight on them. We could have a whole meeting just about this manifesto, what we agree with, what resonates with us, what we disagree with, what seems still current, what things we feel like are outdated, and we're not gonna do that tonight. But what we are gonna do is we're going to, I'm gonna turn it over to Kaylin, who's gonna talk more about this idea of consciousness raising that's mentioned in the manifesto and such a cornerstone of the strategy for fighting and women's liberation. And then we will do a CR-like series of readings from current members of Redstockings and also some members of NWL. So thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Kaylin. I am a member of National Women's Liberation and I'm on the steering committee for the New York chapter. So we talked quite a bit about conscious raising tonight already, but just to kind of give people an overview of what it is and just to kind of remind us of why we do it and why it's such a powerful tool for us. So CR is a tool that the women's liberation movement adopted from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and back then it was called Telling It Like It Is. In CR, women answer a question using examples from their personal lives. Then the group uses those personal testimonies to draw conclusions about the political root of women's so-called personal problems. So some things that CR is used to do is it's used to collect and analyze data, and that data is actually women's lived experiences. It gets to the root of sexism and it figures out who benefits and who pays. It understands the pain and struggles in our lives are not individual problems and that we cannot solve them on our own. And it helps us take action using CR as the basis for our theory and strategy. So just kind of going off of that, I've been to quite a few events where members of NWL have gone out into the world and have spoken at different feminist events or different radical events, and it's really fascinating when members of NWL hold a CR at those events, how much people react to it and how much it obviously impacts them, it fires people up, it makes people want to start implementing change, and it really gets them to talk from their own lived experiences. And you can see like when people around the room start like nodding their heads being like, I'm going through the same thing. So I mean, just even in the past year when I've done conscious raisings, it's really remarkable seeing how it affects people, and it kind of, I think, really speaks to the fact of why this is still a really powerful tool that we use. So kind of in that spirit, tonight we are applying the CR method and theory to the reading and studying aspects of our feminist work. So we're going to have different women come up and read different pieces of feminist work that have spoken to them. And the questions that we asked them to consider were, why have you chosen this selection to read to us? And has it affected your life and politics? How and why? So first up, we're gonna have Lydia.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi. If you don't know me, my name is Lydia. I suspect that we all organize this slightly differently, so that will be cool to see. So, when I joined one of NWL's predecessor groups in 2006, they would sell many different Redstockings packets at meetings, like similar to all those ones that are on that table. That was like every single meeting. And one of the first things that I bought was Feminist Revolution. If you don't own it, you should buy it. So when I read Kathie Sarachild's piece, Going for What We Really Want, which is in Feminist Revolution, it completely changed the way I thought about activism. So when I was in college, the local state NWL had a campus organizers program, and I had co-founded our on-campus abortion rights group, and we relied on NWL for resources, but also on their ideas, and they would kind of give us direction for things to work on campus. So for example, we've like phone banked for them in support of local candidates who I didn't really know and had no idea what they thought about anything, but we phone banked for them. We put up signs opposing the confirmation of John Roberts to the Supreme Court. I'm showing my age. We posted flyers around campus about getting EC in the ER and things like that. So I thought at the time that I really wanted to continue this work after I graduated, and I wondered what was the best way to make a real impact in the world. Should I get a master's in public health or public policy? Should I go to law school? I wondered whether it was better to try to influence the people who made decisions, or should I try to, get a seat at the table to be one of the people who makes the decisions. So I want to read a portion of the opening for Going for What We Really Want. Kathie writes, "But the real question is not working from inside or outside the present economic and political system. The real question is, what are you working for? What are your final goals, both personal and political? It's not a question of working inside or outside of the system. It's a question of whether we want to finally go after what we really want, our own true desires, or whether we are toning down our desires, lying about them, even to ourselves, in order to get favors from men who have power. It's a question of knowing what our true desires are and working wherever we are, in whatever way we are able to achieve the power over our lives that we need." And further down she writes, "It's a question of whether some of us are out to get a few favors from men under male supremacy, or whether we're out to eliminate male supremacy once and for all." So the idea that I should ask myself what I wanted and needed and fight for those things was really new for me. Nobody had ever said that I should do that or just expressed that idea. I realized I'd been fighting for things without thinking about the bigger picture or what my personal needs were. And it's not to say that fighting against John Roberts' Supreme Court nomination wasn't important and wouldn't hurt women. It would, and it has. But I wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. Why go from little thing to little thing without a cohesive understanding of what I really want and then go for that thing? Going for what I really want was the strategy that I'd been missing. So when I came into the group, we were in the middle of the Morning After Pill campaign. It was going for what we really want in action. So in college, we'd been talking about EC in the ER, and some other students were trying to get the Morning After Pill in the campus health center, which, by the way, was closed on the weekends when you would need it. But in this group, we were fighting for full access to the morning after pill without a prescription, not just over the counter, but on the shelf right next to the condoms. I thought about the time in college when I used the morning after pill. A guy had pressured me into having sex without a condom. And I was lucky. My doctor here in New York was great, and she'd written me a prescription to take with me to college just in case. She broke the law for me. But when it came time to use it, I was worried about using my one get out of jail free card, right? I had one chance. I remember talking to my friend about it, saying, I don't know, it was only a few seconds before I told him to stop, get off me. So was it really worth it? Maybe I'm okay, maybe I shouldn't do it. We decided it was probably better safe than sorry. So that Sunday I went to the local CVS and filled the prescription. Lucky for me, I did not have any problems with the pharmacist, although it was a fear, particularly in Minnesota where I was. But I also had to present my insurance card and pay a $15 copay. Now, I was on my dad's insurance at the time, and I still honestly have no idea how the whole health insurance thing works, but especially then, I had no idea. I mean, I thought to myself, was my dad gonna get a notification that I bought the morning after pill? But I was too far in at that point, and I had to get it. So working on the morning after pill campaign and putting the theory of going for what we really want into practice, I realized that what I needed was not EC in the ER, and not even the morning after pill at my campus health center. So this reading, those ideas really put that together for me, that we needed it on the shelf. That's what would have helped me. I think about this in the context of the fight for Medicare for All right now. I was recently talking to my brother who supports Medicare for All, but he said even though he supports it, we should tell people it's not gonna happen right away. We're eventually gonna work towards it. And I said to him, okay, implementing the program is one thing, but it sounds like you're saying you want incremental progress. Why would we do that? When has incrementalism ever worked? He said, look at Obamacare. I said, what are you talking about? Single payer was never part of the discussion. We ended up with something that supposedly helped people, but I've never really heard that many people say that it helped them all that much. They still have problems with it. And then some of it was immediately overturned by the Supreme Court, right? And then we've been fighting about it in Congress, and 10 years has gone by, and what have we gotten? We should be fighting for what we really want. Now, Kathie talks about fighting for abortion law repeal and I'm gonna read you a part of it because it made me think about this experience with my brother. She wrote, it was the demand for repeal that rallied all the people to the march, that rallied all the people who worked on the court case, that created all the pressure which got us the most liberal abortion law in the nation. We didn't get what we really wanted, but at least we fought for what we really wanted. We let them know that what we really wanted, we let them know what we really wanted and that we're not going to stop fighting for women's liberation till we get it, and a lot else too. And by doing this, we actually won some real relief in our lives, much more than we would have ever gotten if we had lied about our desires and supported reform. So I could go, all right. I could go on and on with different examples about how these ideas have helped develop me politically, and that's why I chose this, but I want to close by reading two excerpts that make two different points. So in this first one, Kathie shows that going for what we really want is actually a very disciplined thing. So she writes, we need a means of keeping what we really want in sight, constantly defining and developing it. To do this, we have to, 1, know exactly what it is we want, what we really want, dare to express it, be able to express it, and therefore define it. 2, know how far we are from what it is we want, be able to analyze this at all times as exactly as possible. In other words, we must figure out what the obstacles are to our true goals and be able to spot them as they are ever changing, ever being turned into new forms. 3, know what exactly it is that has gotten our improvements, reforms, changes when they do occur. 4, have tactics which, among other things, come from knowing all the above. We must devise the most effective tactics for overcoming the obstacles, and these tactics will include strategic advances or strategic retreats. And in this second point, and then I'll end after this, I mean, this point is really all over the piece, and I could spend 10 minutes talking about just this alone. But it's the point that going for what we really want is not only a strategy for winning, but it's a strategy for organizing, which we're really gonna need if we stand a chance at winning. So she writes, in order to stay alive, the movement must grow. It has to keep growing, reaching more and more women and therefore more and more corners of male supremacy. But women aren't going to keep on joining the movement. Women aren't going to stay in the movement unless it expresses our true desires, unless it tells the truth and fights for the truth.
Lydia. So I'm Allison Gutu, and I'm also an organizer with National Women's Liberation, and I lead in the Women of Color Caucus as well. So I too am going to be reading from my copy of Feminist Revolution, which has had its wear over the years. So I'm very happy with it. And I'm reading from the article, The Power of History. It's the very first powerhouse article in the book by Kathie Sarachild. And Kathie writes, it has only been 6 years since the women's liberation movement mushroomed, and already the radical women who initiated the movement's theory, organizing ideas and slogans, have been buried from public consciousness, and the liberals have taken over, claiming credit for the radicals' achievements. If this goes on much longer, feminism will go under once again, and we will lose almost all of what we have gained in the last years, both the radical consciousness and many of the practical reforms. It won't be long now until the liberals will be gone too. Further down, if there is resistance to identifying origins of the movement, there is even more resistance to identifying results. This too is part of the veritable rush to prove that a movement by women and for women isn't really necessary. People may acknowledge that women have started a movement, but then argue that it's not necessary anyway. They deny that the movement has anything to do with the changes that are occurring. They even argue that the movement is hurting women's hopes and chances of effecting any further change. One example is the frequent denial by male employers that it was feminist, quote, complaints that forced them to begin hiring or promoting women. After the Metropolitan Museum of Art signed an affirmative action agreement with the New York State Attorney General to stop discrimination in hiring, a museum official described the predominance of women on the new promotion roster as, quote, a coincidence and, quote, happenstance. This is from the New York Times, July of 1974. Or they may try to prove that the changes began before they really did, that they had already begun to take action before the movement, or before the arm of the law hit them. At home, men will claim that they do the housework more if only the women would stop asking. The women's liberation movement has not been alone in this. The papers, pamphlets, and journals from the Black liberation movement have been full of accounts of discovering the mistake of disregarding the importance of the movement's history. The continuous tradition, right up through the most recent efforts. As usual, Black militants are quite a few years ahead of all the other radicals in the country in discovering this. The activists in the peace movement, too, had to experience the wonderful surge of power of the genuine radical mass movement to feel the revolutionary potential of this country, and then see it being taken away from the people again, through history, to learn the power of history in anything but a rhetorical sense. All of us apparently have had to go through the school of hard knocks to learn this lesson. Simply reading about the importance of history doesn't seem to do it, unfortunately. As a result, far too much of the women's liberation movement history and ideas went unformulated and unrecorded by the movement itself. Much of that which was recorded and developed by outsiders claiming to represent the movement's history was incomplete. That which was recorded and seen has been systematically disassociated and ripped off from its origins, both personal and political, in the movement by the very opponents of the developments. Because the movement's neglect of this issue of history and some confusion about it, that crucial battlefield was gained by others. In fact, in general, the only people who didn't rush to take credit for the achievements, who didn't join the opportunistic rush, were the very genuine, sincere activists who had created them. This was a terrible mistake, the price for which feminism is still paying. Because of it, radical women are in danger of winning every battle but losing the war. This next part is so critical. And she writes, as in unity, in the organized movement, there is power. So in continuity, or history, there is power. If unity is hard to achieve, continuity may be even harder. It like goosebumps just thinking and reading it. Continuity may be even harder. Continuity, in fact, is a form of unity, an essential part of unity and a higher form, because it also involves the power of persistence. To win, women uniting is not enough. Women must unite and persist, but without a history, persistence is impossible. Having access to radical theory is not all it takes to understand it, however. Connected with revisionism is also the problem of people who do read and recite the original works, but cannot understand them because they never experienced what the revolutionaries are writing about. They lack experience, movement experience, action experience. What awakens interest in the original revolutionary sources and what awakens comprehension, sometimes quite suddenly changing a dark, dense page into a brilliant light, is personal experience in trying to change history. And the last section that I'll quote from is the last part of the paper. The fight against revisionism is really an extension of the ideas of consciousness raising, which, after all, was all about going to the original sources, women themselves, for knowledge rather than what is said about them by others. History adds movement experience to the material available for consciousness raising and extends it back in time. But there are many other issues that need re-examination. Because we have advanced, the old issues have taken on new twists that make them as exciting as when they were first discussed. The necessary critiques of the old issues promise to be a return also to the old, interesting, exciting quality of the movement, with hope for new unity and another step forward. Because that is what is going back to the roots, going back into history is all about. It's really about moving forward. It's about creating the new, not opposing it. It's about building the new on the shoulders of the old. That is a quote that really reminds me of the Sankofa concept, which is an African concept that means looking back to go forward, symbolized by a bird that is looking back over itself in order to go forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, I see that.
So the point about not seeing how history plays out until you yourself are in a liberation fight and then it jumps off the page for you is really, really true for me. One point I'll make is that about radical leadership and leaders being kicked out by liberals for liberal approaches. So I was part of a group, the Street Harassment Project, which was around from 1999 to 2006. I joined in 2000. This was a feminist grassroots group founded by a radical feminist who was part of Redstockings Allies and Veterans. She's here tonight, and that's Fran Luck. I was actually recruited into the organization by another feminist who's here tonight, Tamara Wyndham. So the group had disagreements along the way. Some wanted to do street actions and confront men. Some of us wanted to plaster the city with anti-harassment messages. Others wanted to form a 501c3 so we could be respectable and receive foundation and corporation grants of money. These others wanted to post reminders along the lines of eat your vegetables, curb your dog, and respect women. Those of us who were drawn to the radical politics, and me, before I even really knew what that meant, knew that the more constrained and barely visible approaches, the liberal approaches, would not ignite the anger of women in the city and would not build change. The short story is that one day in 2006, two of us received an email stating that the others had taken the graphics, the website, the empty bank account, and the group's contact list, and would be forming these into a new group. While I was shocked and stunned, cheated out of a group that I helped build, and my comrade, the founder, Fran, having been ousted from a group that she did the legwork for and helped lead into existence, reading The Power of History and talking with Kathie Sarachild and Carol Giardina and others helped me understand the reasons for this and how to prevent it from happening again. Another example is in the healthcare fight that that Lydia mentioned. So in healthcare organizing in 2010, when I look back now and I'm like, how could I have thought this? But when I thought we might get some kind of single payer type, insurance happening, or universal healthcare for all with no insurance companies in it, everybody in, nobody out, and instead we got Obamacare. Just as the movement was really getting active, right? Healthcare Now was doing a lot of organizing. There were arrest actions happening in Congress and all over the country. And this whole public option thing, which seemed the most sort of left or expansive model thus far proposed in Congress or whatever, even just for that, this activism was really happening. Just as that was happening, we saw these changes in group names and in the terms being used. So groups that were not using the term universal healthcare were now saying universal healthcare, when what did they mean? These tiny reforms to how the health insurance companies would cheat us out of everything, right? And there was even a group, there was this group, Healthcare Now still exists, still doing amazing work. And there was another group that we noticed popped up called Healthcare for All Now, something like that.
Healthcare for America.
Healthcare for America Now. And it was just a group that was basically fighting for these tiny, reforms, kind of like this 14 men and a nun sort of, if you can have this many babies and if you were raped, then maybe you can get an abortion. It was fighting for these tiny reforms. But they were this group that cut people off from the history, right? Cut people off from the real radical group and moved them into this liberal group. So I saw that as we were organizing. It was like, what do we do? Also want to say briefly the use of history in the morning after pill action, which you've heard a little bit about, and that was between 2003 and 2013. It was a lesson in and of itself as we were starting to organize on this to look back at our own movement history, right? Like where do you start in a campaign? In looking at movement history, we knew to start with consciousness raising, CR, and in using CR, we uncovered the experiences of everyday women. For one thing, the side effects were really mild for most women. We had been hearing that the side effects from the morning after pill were really bad and it made, you were going to be cramping, it's going to be terrible, and it was really dangerous and all this kind of stuff. And that wasn't the case from our experience. Also, most of us didn't need it because of rape or because we went to an emergency room at any point, but because of men refusing to wear condoms, the condom breaking, forgetting to take the birth control pill, or deciding that we weren't going to use birth control. And all of this helped us go for and ultimately win what we really wanted. Finally, I also learned about leadership and giving credit to the leaders. This is important because not crediting the leaders cuts people off from the source, the historical source, the primary sources. It's not about credit for credit's sake or ego, but reading this helped me understand that liberal forces are like a constant rushing river that sweeps away almost everything in its path. Maybe this is why the term mainstream resonates. In every period, the liberal or watered down politics, the politics of the realistic quote, the quote respectable, the toned down, are all around us. And it is our job to understand this and to 1, do history defense or correct the revisionist history, and 2, to organize knowing that the mainstream ideas will continue to flow over us and drown us out unless we build a movement so strong, so widespread, so coordinated, and so visible, and so protected and structured in a way that it cannot be erased by the powers that be, it cannot be co-opted by liberal approaches and liberal people. I hope you join us or another organization in that work.
I have some material to put up here. Thank you.
Allison, and thank you, everybody. It's great to get this feedback. Okay, this is going to be kind of a show and tell about my experience. One of them, anyway, that is about to become important again, I believe. Has anybody?
Who are you?
Oh, I'm Kathie Sarachild. How many people have heard of the Equal Rights Amendment? Everybody, good. That means it's coming back into the news. Although I'll say that at the beginning, the radicals of the women's liberation movement, including Redstockings, weren't that interested in the Equal Rights Amendment. So this is kind of a story of how I learned that we were kind of wrong when the opposition we went through this thing, which happens again and again. It happened with the abortion struggle, and it happened with the Equal Rights Amendment. It appeared in the beginning of the movement that the power structure was for these things. In fact, certain radicals, like I remember Roxanne Dunbar, actually thought that and some black radicals too, they thought that the abortion struggle was an establishment plot for various reasons, from black genocide to just diverting the movement. And anyway, it was very surprising to learn that there was all this opposition that came later, and even some of the people who were for abortion in the beginning, like Ronald Reagan and George Bush. George Bush was on the board of Planned Parenthood in 1970, and Ronald Reagan passed it appeared that they were for these things, and that kind of kept people away from the movement. People were suspicious of the movement. Okay, so this also sort of happened with the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm going to read from and tell about material that I worked on with others that was full of startling surprises and lessons as we went along. I'm going to show and tell a few of these surprises and even anticipate how one of these old realizations and slogans is probably going to be needed again real soon. Because it looks like after this long period, when the ERA disappeared because the time limit was not met, and the whole thing was dropped for decades. It's coming back. I'm not going to go into the story of how it's coming back, which is an interesting story, but there isn't time. I just want to say, so I don't forget it at the end, that there's a good chance it's going to win all the states. In fact, there's just now one more state to go.
No, it's won that. It's at 38.
It is now.
No, I'm sorry,
I
you're
think
right.
it's one more.
No, they have to
Yeah, it just passed Virginia. And I'm wearing a button from the 70s about the struggle. What's probably going to happen is it's going to win in all the states it's supposed to win in, and then it's going to go to the Supreme Court. So there it's going to be a huge battle. And this slogan here that was used back then, no time limit on equality, is going to be the kind of thing that we're going to have to get out in front of the Supreme Court and shout and shout. Anyway, this is a little bit of what some of the obstacles were. Because that's going to be the big issue. I have this here because I just want to tell you that there are several stages of this. Oh, you know what? I'm missing one thing I need. Can somebody hand me one of the flag posters that's back there? It's on the table. There are a bunch of them. Oh yeah, okay, thanks, Alex. By the way, Alex was an original Redstockings. This is Alex Schulman. Whoops, there we go. Okay. So these things represent stages of understanding. How long it took for me to understand this question of the time limit on the ERA.
I think that microphone might be on.
I'll be reading from and others. Oh yes, I just also want to say this, all this material here that's up here, not the newspaper, but this and some other things, is on the Redstockings website. So you can read it for free. And I'm not advocating that National Women's Liberation make a big deal of the ERA. But I am thinking that there will come a time when it will be an important thing to back, probably at this point when it's before the Supreme Court. And that's when a lot of noise is going to make a big difference in that, you know. And it's going to be important to understand some of this too. But also, it's really not the details. It's the details of how the time limit was hidden by the organizers of the movement, so that nobody even knew it existed. Really, it was only when it became an emergency that we suddenly learned about this time limit. Okay. So that's what you can read about on the webpage, and I really think it's worth going to check out because of number one, because it's really an example. It's going to be useful for what's coming up, but also it's a real example of not going for what you really want in accepting this time limit. Just one other thing, if you're interested in working with Redstockings, because we need lots more research in many areas. We call ourselves a grassroots think tank, and this kind of thing for strategy and the continuing struggle is a huge help, and I think it's also, you'll find it very interesting. Because there isn't much time, I'm going to I may end up just reading and explaining this one poster because it's short, and we already sang the song from it. However, I want to just say that this poster was distributed when we knew very little. It's a call to abolish the time limit, not extend it. And it was distributed at a big march of 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. that Fran was at. It turns out I had forgotten who was at it. Yeah,
of the march.
And she has photos of our team that was distributing this. We brought 5,000 copies calling for abolishing the time limit, not bothering with this 3-year measly extension. This was in 1978. And it was Carol Hanish's idea. Here, let me just want to make sure.
Kathie, should I pass these around? There's 4 of them. If everyone promised to give me back, or should I just?
You can't see a lot. I mean, if you want to, sure. Yeah, it's just, you know, when I look at those photos, I was trying to remember who was there. So it was good to hear. I can't recognize too many people, so more people came than I remember. All right, let's see. I can't tell you what a surprise. Oh yes, so Carol Hanish. So this poster in pretty big letters calls for abolishing the time limit. When we'd only done a little research on the Constitution, the only kind of fact in here to back up abolishing the time limit when they're all calling for a 3-year extension is this. It says here, a message from women. Women demand 1, not an extension of 7 years. By the way, then in 78, they were calling for a 7-year extension. They didn't get a 7-year extension. They only got a 3-year extension. But at this march, they were calling for a 7-year. And 2, immediate passage of the ERA. So abolition of the time limit, not an extension. The reluctance to put into the law of the land that women are equal to men, at least in principle, is an insult to women, and one that women have been feeling very acutely. Here's the really important part, I think. Don't be fooled. The Constitution set no time limits on amendments. Congress did it in 1917, and Congress can undo it. Now, that's all we had learned at the point that we distributed all these 5,000 copies. And it wasn't completely right, because Congress didn't set it for all time limits. Each time limits began to come up for these amendments. So that what we learned, even after these various things we kept learning more and more about this. And some of this to the point where on the website, you'll see that there's a congressional record account by the then president of the Woman's Party about what a terrible mistake it was that they didn't listen to Alice Paul. How many people know who Alice Paul is? She fought for, Alice Paul was the leader in the really beautiful sense of the word of going first and everything, going on hunger strikes, being force-fed in this country and leading other women into doing the same thing. Anyway, she wrote and said they tried to slap a time limit on the suffrage amendment, and we would not accept it. So that it began to be a new technique of, at the time we did this, we had no idea that they tried to slap a time limit on the suffrage amendment. We just had learned it wasn't in the Constitution. None of this was getting said by the leaders of the ERA march or demonstration. In fact, as I said, none of us even knew there was a time limit. Now, you can get into what thinking, you know. In our research, we learned that when it had been, Alice Paul had been trying for 40 years, and the remnants of the Women's Party had been trying for 40 years to get this to pass through Congress, and it never could. Why? Because even though it appeared to have support, it was false support from the establishment, right? There was all, the Republican Party, even the Democratic Party, the big wigs, and they always insisted, it always came down to, at that point, it wasn't the time limit that was the obstacle, it was protective legislation.
That's right.
And it wasn't that the Women's Party people were against protective legislation for workers. They were for protective legislation just for women workers. And talk about go for what you really want. All these labor groups that were protecting only women because they didn't think they could win protective legislation for all workers. I mean, protective legislation for all workers was the radical demand. Instead, it was just made into protective legislation for women, which would work to keep women out of jobs. But that was the issue again and again. So here, what we did was we took this cartoon, which refers to, this was a cartoon of this man standing on a woman's back, and it actually, originally it said protective legislation on the ERA. And instead we put here the 7-year time limit on the ERA, because anyway, the ERA thing is very interesting. There isn't time, as I said, to go into it. There's lots to learn about that. But, and I'm just focusing on the time limit right now. But it has to do, you know, with the Civil Rights Act, relations with the black movement, relations with the labor movement. Okay, I'm running out of time. I think I've made all my main points. I urge you to go, one last thing. You can see that what we put on this side of the flyer was Carol's song, Fight On Sisters, Fight On. And the most applicable of the verses here is, we've made some mistakes and don't get it wrong. The forces against us are wily and strong. That's what this is all about. And then again, these chants, no time limits on justice, no time limits for equality. And I'll just say one thing about this, the crazy schizophrenic thing that was going on with this time limit, this particular button, this slogan, no time limit on equality, was actually, as I understand it, coined by Jimmy Carter to fight for the extension, not to fight for abolishing the time limit. It seems to say abolish, right? No time, but he meant it to win the extension. So that's how crazy it can get. But now, the whole basis of the new push for the ERA is that this time limit is not in the Constitution, and the time limit shouldn't count. And the time limit wasn't really in the amendment, it was only in the introduction to the amendment. And so that's why it's going to be so important to be out there at the Supreme Court screaming no time limit on equality when it comes to that.
Or maybe on the 8th when it comes up in Virginia. I was advised by the person I interviewed
I
last
think it's
night.
been voted for and it passed Virginia, I believe.
Well, we just debated that too.
No, it's one more they need, Utah, I think. There's still one more.
No, Virginia is the 38th. No doubt
You're
about
sure?
it. Yeah, absolutely sure, yeah.
Well, it's very close. It
So,
seems like
it's gonna happen.
it seems like it's gonna happen.
But there will be advice to go there.
Okay,
when they
next.
vote.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Jenny Brown, and I have been involved with Gainesville Women's Liberation starting in 1985 and Redstockings shortly thereafter. And I am going to, the document that I want to talk about is the censored section of Feminist Revolution.
Yeah.
And I'll say a little bit of the effect that it had on me, and then I'll read a part of the censored section. So when I came to college at the University of Florida, the first year I was there, Gloria Steinem came to speak on campus. And she was, of course, billed as this big deal radical feminist, so I expected it to be radical and feminist when I went to hear the talk. And it was kind of a nothing. I really don't remember anything she said except something about be brave and take action. It was all very vague. You know, in general, I cared about feminism. I had the impression feminism was in my interest, but I didn't really see how it fit into the other things I was interested in, like socialism. My first attempt to join a group at the University of Florida was I tried to join the Democratic Socialists of America because it had socialist in the name. But I was also interested in solidarity with the revolutionary movements in Central America and the US-funded wars there, and the development by the Reagan administration of first-strike nuclear weapons, and abortion rights. And even on the explicitly feminist stuff, Steinem didn't provide any insight to me on how we should fight for abortion rights, for example, or how we had even fought for them before. History was completely absent from her talk. A couple months later, I ran into Gainesville Women's Liberation organizers Judith Brown and Carol Giardina, and they were selling Feminist Revolution on campus with the censored section stuck into it. So this section was inserted in the book. And that was really interesting, right? Because a censored section, what did they not want us to know? Well, how did this get censored? That whole story. And then when I saw that it was about Steinem and her association with the Central Intelligence Agency, it started me thinking about feminism in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. So I already knew about the CIA and other countries, how they had assassinated people's leaders and undermined socialist governments. So when I got the book, and I think actually Judith managed to sell me Feminist Revolution twice in the first couple of years. But when I got the book, I think the only thing I read initially was the censored section. Later, of course, I read the whole book, and that filled in much more about the connection between radical movements and feminism, and the connections that are mentioned in there, for example, the understandings that the women's liberation movement got from the civil rights movement and Black Power and the Chinese Revolution, and then examples of consciousness raising among guerrillas in Guatemala, useful quotes from Malcolm X. And then I learned that many of the founders of the women's liberation movement came from civil rights, anti-war or New Left organizing into feminism, but I didn't know any of that until so what I remember, it started me on the road to understanding, and of course, these memories can be wrong and they can be distorted by things